Let's do it!
MainMan.
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 MainMan. I can tell you everything about MainMan. Why and what and how and whether it was exciting or not. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. A very long, wonderful adventure.
Hello and welcome to episode 15 in our series that explores the history of MainMan, the groundbreaking management rights company that redefined the rock and roll business model in the 70s, and in so doing became synonymous with the decadence and indulgences that are now rock folklore.
We had this fantastic idea of playing this gig at the Roundhouse where we supported Country Joe and the Fish as kind of comic book heroes.
MainMan was formed by entrepreneur and impresario Tony DeFries, who worked with a diverse range of clients that included Amanda Lear, Dana Gillespie, Lou Reed, Mick Ronson, John Mellencamp, Iggy Pop, Mott the Hoople, and David Bowie.
I think that throughout the 60s and most of the 70s I was driven by lust. As much as anything, it's a great creative force.
In this episode, we're featuring another of the larger-than-life characters that was a regular visitor to Haddon Hall. We're delving into the MainMan archive to explore the importance and influence of one of the key characters in the early part of David Bowie's career, mime legend Lindsay Kemp. David first met Lindsay in 1967, when David's girlfriend at the time, who was the receptionist for his then manager, convinced him to go and see one of Lindsay's performances because he was playing David's album as interval music. Previously uninterested in mime, David became infatuated, and so began a long and very influential relationship with Lindsay that reshaped David's visual approach to music and performance. Here's Lindsay explaining how mime became popular in the UK in the 60s and how he first met David.
Well, I think, Marcel Marceau began coming to London in the 50s. And then through the 60s. And I think he was a very big influence. There were suddenly quite a few imitators. And then the Bricus show, Stop the World, was a wonderful show, I thought, and Newley was great in that. And mime started creeping almost into the mainstream. And I began about that time also. About 1958, I began appearing with a white face on the stage. And like so many others, copying Marcel Marceau, who I idolized and then later went on to study and work with. But all my life I've been, very fascinated, passionate about the circus, and particularly about the Italian Commedia dell'arte, the white-faced Pierrots. And I've done many versions of Pierrot, from Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire, etc., through to the music hall Pierrots and white-faced clowns like Buster Keaton and the pale faces of Stan Laurel. And it was those people, of course, that David was also very enthusiastic, very passionate about. I was performing a little show with my company at the Little Theatre, which is just off St. Martin's Lane, a show called The Tinsel People. And David came to see that show. I had heard a record. A mutual friend had given me the D-Ram record, and I used it. I fell in love with him. And the track, When I Live My Dream, I played as preset music. And he was very flattered, loved the show, and came round backstage afterwards and expressed a desire to be part of my world and to learn from me. So the very next day, he came to my flat in Bateman Street in Soho, and we laughed a lot, we played a lot. He brought his 12-string guitar along, and he sang a lot. And we put together that very day a little show which was to be called Pierrot in Turquoise. And I love Jacques Brel. And the first evening, our first date, after we'd been to the Tibetan Society, where David took me to a meeting there. He was very involved in the Free Tibet movement. But after that, we went to the Duchess Theatre to see a little show called Jacques Brel is Alive and Well and Living in Paris. And, we went night after night after night to see that show. It was very much influenced, by that style and by the French chantant and so on. We played a lot of that music, from Edith Piaf and Stan Laurel and Buster Keaton and Harry Langdon and so on. I mean, people that all my life have been a very great influence, has in fact, been the silent cinema. And also Pure and Turquoise was very much, set in that kind of setting. It was a kind of a circus musical, backstage, cabaret, much akin to The Blue Angel, which we looked at a lot in those early films. And the following day he began doing classes with me at the dance centre in Covent Garden. He was very, very keen to learn. He was very passionate about everything he did. He was fabulously responsive, but very stiff. I really taught him, I increased his physical flexibility for a start, and then I helped him express himself through his body. I taught him the art of stillness, the art of walking, which most people find very difficult, the art of dancing and of twirling, and I taught him projection. And I taught him the economy of gesture, economy of movement, and mime. I taught him everything I knew, in fact, in the time that we were together. David has a very immense talent, God knows, but he's a singer, and he's not a mime. I taught him what I had learned from Marcel Marceau. I taught him, an amount of technique, but one is either a mime or not a mime. It's like a clown, you're a clown or you're not a clown, or a singer or not a singer. David was a singer and a very good one and a very fine musician, but not a mime. He struggled with it. God knows. He painted his face white, but that's not enough. I think he abandoned it wisely after a while. I'd love to sing, but I can't because I can't. I'm silent. And I helped him express himself with movement, and the mime training that I did give to him obviously helped his stage performances immensely. My work had a very great Japanese influence. I was particularly influenced by the No theatre and by the bunraku puppets and by the kabuki. And I always taught my students, what I know. I didn't know very much about it then, and I know quite a lot more about it now because I've been to Japan a lot, and I've worked there and danced there and studied with kabuki masters. But at that time, it was pretty much my own version. And then, of course, he had Kansai, the Japanese designer, who did his costumes, and my own movement, very much influenced by Japan, and also, the Oriental theatre in general, Kathakali, and so on. And, of course, what I realize now was very similar to Butoh. Butoh I didn't know anything about in those days, but looking at old videos of that show now, I think, that's very Butoh and so on. And of course it was very influenced by the avant-garde theatre. He wasn't really into rock and roll at that time. I got a surprise several years later when Angela Bowie came up to Edinburgh with the Ziggy Stardust album, and with the request from David and Tony de Vries that I should go to London and stage that production. And David said on the telephone, look, when you hear it, you might get a surprise because I've really changed quite a bit. This is quite rock and roll, Lindsay. But I was thrilled by the rock and roll element. Anyway, I've always been a kind of a rock and roller, albeit a relatively silent one.
That event that Angela invited Lindsay to work on was a piece of rock theatre that David had been planning for several months as part of his long-held desire to stage a musical. Inspired by the works of an avant-garde group called The Living Theatre, who incorporated scaffolding, raised platforms and screens into their performances, David wanted to do the same with a Ziggy show. So across 2 nights on August 19th and 20th in 1972 at London's Rainbow Theatre, David combined the Living Theatre concept with lighting he'd seen in the show Cabaret, to produce a rock spectacle to surpass anything ever staged up until that point. It was the ideal concept for Lindsay to utilise all his stage experience. So while David was busy planning and rehearsing in London, he arranged for Angela to visit Lindsay in Scotland and invite him to create some Ziggy-worthy effects for the show.
Angela said, "You'll have a free hand." And she said, "Have a listen to this. And let's hear your ideas if you can come down to London the day after tomorrow." And I had 24 hours in which to listen to the music and visualise. And then I went down to London to meet Tony DeFries at a studio. And I acted and danced and mimed out the entire show. Gunter Grove, I remember that was. And, well, they were delighted. So, and a few days later, with some members of my company, we had been performing Flowers in Edinburgh. And with some of my troupe, we got together, and with 3 days' rehearsals, we put on the show. I did the lighting and the scenery and our costumes anyway, and directed Bowie. They were wonderful. They were very responsive. It was a lot of fun. They enjoyed it all very, very. It was a very, very enjoyable time. I remember working all night. The night before the opening, David went off to bed about 2 a.m, but we were still doing the lighting at 11 o'clock the following morning and so on, the day we opened. When he first walked onto the stage singing Lady Stardust, that was Bowie, and it was Bowie at his most marvellous, because his medium, is his music and his voice. What was such a joy for me was to see how he projected himself on the stage. That was extraordinary. That very first entrance was extraordinary. It was choreographed from beginning to end. From David's first solo entrance, coming from far upstage through clouds of dry ice in that wonderful Kansai red costume. And the response, of course, was incredible. It was incredible. We, the dancers, were perched on different levels above the stage on scaffolding. I was the highest, as usual. Petrified up there for a very long time. Not only was David did Lady Stardust, but, and I think we all wore Lady Stardust masks, look-alike masks. But before that, there was the Beethoven Clockwork Orange theme, which I wasn't expecting. So that was David's idea, and that came in as a big surprise. At one point, a screen came down, and it was either Suffragette City, maybe, and we projected a film of Kenneth Anger. And there were other projections. I think there was Jean Angelou we projected, and Magritte paintings and so on and so forth. I don't think that David needed all the trappings of the Rainbow concert. I don't really think he needed us. He didn't really need me as Queen Bitch wearing one of my old frocks. And I also did Starman, da 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 da, and I came down I think 100-foot ladder from the flies of that vast Rainbow Theatre. But I think it was decided that, we weren't really essential to the show. And I always encouraged David anyway, through my teaching, to keep it simple and to be economical. For me, the best number in the show was when David just sat on a stool and sang Jacques Brel's My Death in a solar spotlight. I was delighted by the success. I'd never experienced anything like that. I never, performed in front of crowds like that before. And of course, I'd shared a stage with David before, but the last time had been at the Intimate Theatre Palmer's Green. And the production was very different then, and so was the audience. I think there were about half a dozen people in the audience. That's when David and I, with Jack Burkett, were doing a stage version of Pierrot in Turquoise, which later became a video version, which we did for Scottish television, called The Looking Glass Murders. Oh, that was about 2 years after the original production of Pierrot in Turquoise. He had changed quite a bit. We were pretty much the same, but I remember being a bit surprised when he didn't accept my invitation to come across the street to the Greasy Spoon for a cup of tea during our rehearsal break. He said, oh no, we'll have something sent over. I thought, sent over? How grand. My dear. And then he became a bit more, distant over the years. I was very pleased that, of course, my work, through David reached a very wide audience indeed. And, of course, my own audience has increased enormously as a result. Suddenly the seats of the theatre where I was playing, were filling up with all the David Bowie lookalikes. Everyone had their hair dyed red and combed in that style. I think it's lasted because, of David's persona, but also the music, because we know, sadly, that so much of the liberated 60s has been forgotten. Much of its influence has faded, but David has managed to carry, I think, really through his music and his songs. It comes from deep, deep inside. His desires to be certain personalities. I think everything he is the chameleon, everything that he is. Aspects of his personality and his desire to be an actor and his desire to be... Unfortunately, his desire to be a clown and a mime, it was a disaster. But, his personality is kind of very chameleon.
Lindsay Kemp talking about his work with David, particularly the now legendary Rainbow Theatre concerts from 1972 that Lindsay choreographed and performed in. Those hugely ambitious shows were very expensive to stage, so the original plans to tour the show were shelved. There are some great photographs, fascinating articles, telexes, letters and production notes from the Rainbow concerts in the MainMan archive, part of an ever-growing collection of memorabilia, a lot of it never seen before, that we're adding to the MainMan label website each week. A really fascinating record of a very exciting period in rock history. That's at mainmanlabel.com. And on the website, you can also check out the other episodes in the MainMan series. I'm Des Shaw, and this is a Zinc Media MM Tech production. Thanks for listening.